I'm sure you know the question that inevitably comes up when you meet someone new. What do you do for a living? Well, in a society that assigns great value to a particular kind of work, you might be more than eager to share about your job or your position or your accomplishments. But if society considers your job to not be so important, you might dodge the question. Not very long ago, I was introduced to a man, and I asked him what he did for a living, and he literally mumbled something very quietly about working for the transportation department. And he said it so softly, I really couldn't make out what he said. But his son was next to him, and he piped up and said, he's a bus driver. Well, it was evident to me that this man was embarrassed to tell me what he actually did for a living. This is so unfortunate because the work of a bus driver is part of what God wants done in the earth. Does God want people to get safely from point A to point B? I think he does. Speaking of transportation and the work of the Lord, I can't help but think of Don Flo. He's the owner of Flo Automotive. It's a chain of automobile sales and service outlets on the East Coast of the United States. I once heard Don Flo speak at an event at Seattle Pacific University, and I was so impressed I asked for permission to share parts of that speech with others, and I'd like to do that with you right now. But before I do, I'd like to remind you of a question that I asked after we saw the story of Jack Van Hardesveld, the hotel salesman, in the last session. The question I asked was, what if every follower of Christ were to integrate his or her faith into the workplace as Jack Van Hardesveld has done? Well, the fact is, I really think it would turn the world upside down in short order. Followers of Christ are already sprinkled like salt throughout the full spectrum of society right now. Os Guinness says in his great book, The Call, which we'll talk about more in session 12, he says, the problem with Western Christians is not that they aren't where they should be, but that they aren't what they should be where they are. Well, let's add Don Flo to the list of great examples. Here's a portion of that speech I heard at Seattle Pacific that I want to share with you.
You know, it's interesting. You'll go through Christian magazines. You can go to seminars on how to live love in marriage and how to live love as a parent and how to live love in urban setting and how to live love in third world nations and everything else. You just can't read about how we're actually supposed to live love in the workplace. What does that really look like? It means expecting God to break into our daily life, giving us the opportunity to care for people in the name of Christ. And you know what? Here's the great thing. It doesn't make any difference where you are in your organizational structure to do that. You need to be the CEO. It means that we put relationships ahead of transactions, and then we relate to every customer like a valued friend. When we do this, we repersonalize the marketplace. Customers are not profit-maximizing opportunities. They are real people with real problems that we're serving. The first commitment is that customers are always assumed to be deserving of extraordinary personal service, even if they don't always prove to be so. For us to make this real, we must be a place that keeps our promises and always does what's right for the customer. We must treat every single person who walks in the showroom, the service lane, the parts department, the body shop, like a valued friend, like a guest in our home, regardless of their station in life. In our company, that means we have a number of unconditional commitments. We call them covenants we make with our customers. And we're willing to be held accountable to them, we post them, and they cost us money if we don't many of them. For instance, in our service departments, we promise to fix your car right the first time. If we don't fix it right the first time, you don't have to pay for additional repairs on the car. If you don't fix it right the first time, we come out to your office or home, pick up your car, fix it, return it, no charge, fully detailed, and fill it up with gas. We promise to only call you with one repair, one cost. So we don't call back. One cost. If we misdiagnose it, that's our problem. We promise to fix your car right the first time, in the time promised. If you don't fix it in the time promised, we take a car out to where you live or work because you shouldn't be inconvenienced. Because you know what? That's what friends would do for friends. they wouldn't inconvenience their life. As soon as you move from the context of seeing that person as a profit-maximizing opportunity to seeing that person as a friend, that fundamentally alters how you operate. I got this letter from this couple from New Jersey area who said, we think we went through a black hole and came to another planet. We were traveling down with our family in a van to Orlando, the Disney World. It was our family's big trip, and the kids have always dreamed of going to Disney World. And at 9 o'clock at night, our van broke down. We called AAA, and they said, your Chevrolet dealership was the only dealership open that late at night. And so they came in, and the service advisor, the person that kind of writes you up, they came in and told their story, and their transmission was locked up, had to be towed in. And so they told him that this was the only free time they had. He had 1 week off a year from his job, and transmission looked like, it was going to be down, etc. So this service advisor went back and talked to the technician and said, would you consider staying all night? Told the story where they were. Went back and called his wife and said, guess who's coming home for dinner tonight? In fact, to spend the night. Let's see if we can get the couch out. And so he did all that. They cooked dinner. Technician, he stayed with the technician. They stayed all night. At 7 o'clock in the morning, they wrapped the car up, and the folks went on. I didn't have any knowledge of this at all. And so the people wrote me this letter and said, is this like normal if it is? We're like moving down here. So I asked them, of course I went, and we did a big celebration. We have this award called Extra Mile Award we do, and recognize people for service and moments of truth and all kind of good stuff. And so it's like, what caused you to do that? And so, isn't that what we're supposed to do?
A friend of mine, Dr. Al Arisman, is the editor of a magazine called Ethics. He interviewed Don Flo for that magazine and asked permission to share some of that interview with others. And I'd like you to hear what Al Arisman discovered about Don Flo in this interview. Don Flo said, we don't have the traditional run back and forth negotiating process. We have a pricing structure that's set. You don't have to be a tough negotiator or more educated to get a fair price. If you've got a PhD, or if you're a janitor, you'll pay the same price for the vehicle. We did a study and found that the people who typically paid the least for the cars were the most able to pay. The least able to pay paid the most. Well, for me, it was wrong to take advantage of the least able, a clear violation of the biblical mandate in the book of Proverbs. He goes on to say, we want to be transparent to our customers. We share all of our information with our customers. In our appraisal process of a car, we go online together with the customer, pull up all the auction reports, Kelly Blue Book, NADA Black Book. We have kiosks in our showroom floors so people can go online. So we try to accommodate the customer at every step in the way they'd like to buy a car. In our operating principle, the customer is in control of the process, and our job is to help the customer in that process. We have a housing assistance program for all entry-level employees. If they save money, we match their down payment to buy a house. But in the end, it can't just be about these things. It must extend to treating each employee as a valued, respected person. We build Habitat for Humanity homes together, and we are involved in dozens of United Way agency programs which we either volunteer for or help start as a company. We are heavy investors in education, from inner city programs up to universities. We have started inner city educational programs and underwrite them. And then he says this, I have a real sense of God calling me to this work. After getting my undergraduate degree, I went to Regent College in Vancouver, BC for a year of Christian studies. I thought about an academic career, but doing what I am doing was as natural for me as a pastor being called to preach in the pulpit. I'm not talking about preaching to those who work for me, to customers or others. I'm not talking about favoring Christians who work here. I want to respect and value all people regardless of their beliefs. But I'm talking about living out the implications of what I believe. This is where my drive comes from. Living out the implications of what I believe. This is where my drive comes from. That's really it in a nutshell. Well, we've looked at some excellent examples of people who live out the implications of their faith in the world, like George Washington Carver and William Wilberforce and Gary Starkweather and John Beckett, Jack Van Hardesvelt, and now Don Flo. They have seamlessly integrated the biblical worldview with their everyday work. And it might seem easy to see these great examples and think, wow, that all makes sense, but it takes a genius to do it, or at least a very gifted person to really integrate faith with work. But that isn't really so, and we have to bring it down to the level where we, as educators and our students, live. For example, how can a hairdresser see her work as the work of God? Well, to answer that question, I'd like to show you part of an interview I did a few years ago with Paul Stevens. He's the author of an excellent book on theology, which I recommend to you, called The Other 6 Days. Stevens wrote this book while he was a professor at Regent College in Vancouver, BC, where Don Flo attended. And that's where he was teaching when I caught up with him for this interview. Let's watch.
Spirit of God and wisdom is given for all kinds of practical skills. God is pleased with that which we do for him. And really, in a sense, the whole idea of worship and work are so tied together. The same Hebrew word is translated both work and worship. Avodah, avodah. In a tremendous act of condescension, God has invited his creature to enter into his work. And so we're doing his work when we make electronic widgets. It's just wonderful to be grasped by this thought that the work of the Lord, or if you're Scottish, you say the work of the Lord, is not just, although it includes Bible teaching and evangelism. Very important. But it also includes all this fabrication and creation and beautifying and organizing, making things run and maintaining and chores. And we're actually doing his work. You know, I had a beauty salon worker once in one of my everyday life courses, and we all introduced ourselves at the beginning, and somebody said, I'm a doctor, and somebody was a teacher, and somebody's a pastor, and she said, I'm just a hairdresser. At the end of the course, she said, wow, I'm a hairdresser. I make people beautiful.
The hairdresser in Paul Stevens' class experienced a fundamental paradigm shift. It was a critical paradigm shift. She realized that in making people beautiful, she could co-work with God. She could bring beauty into the world, and she began to see that as part of the work of God in the earth. She dealt with the old sacred-secular split, and she realized that she didn't have a secular job. She was doing the work of the Lord. Now, someone might ask, if hairdressers are doing the work of the Lord, who then are the ministers? Well, I'll let Professor Stevens answer that question.
Our concept of pastoral ministry, for which we equip people here, and not all people here are going into pastoral ministry. We have doctors and teachers and lawyers and business people and etc. and artists as well. But the pastoral concept we have is really that the pastor will be an equipper. Not the representative minister, but the equipper. And that comes from Ephesians 4:11-12. And basically the text says that God has given, besides apostles and evangelists and prophets, he's given pastor teachers for the equipment of the saints for the work of the ministry. Who does the ministry? In the King James Version with the fatal comma, it looked like the pastor teacher did it. But actually there's no comma in the original language. And in fact, it's the saints that do the ministry. The church is really a rhythm of gathering and dispersion. Just as the blood is gathered in the heart and lungs for oxygenation cleansing, and then is pumped out to the tips of the fingers and tips of the toes and brings hormones and enzymes, nutrients, and in the process gets dirty and tired, has to come back to the heart and lungs for oxygenation and cleansing. So it's a constant gathering of the blood and dispersion. And in a sense, you can't take a still picture of the church. You can only take a motion picture, or better still, an angiogram of the church. So-called laity, and that word's not a good word, but non-clergy members of the people of God cannot liberate themselves. And the clergy cannot liberate themselves, because the clergy has an impossible task of embodying the whole ministry of the church in their own person. They have to liberate each other. The clergy has to begin to empower, encourage through teaching, through modeling, through understanding the systemic life of the church and working with that, recognizing the providential and God-given place that God has placed every member of the church in homes and workplaces and societies and schools and all the rest of it. So they're dispersed in very strategic places.
Now, this might be a new concept for some of you watching this, and it may be a little bit out of your idea of the Lord's work, and if so, I urge you to read Paul Stevens' book, The Other 6 Days. The topic of theology of work has really gained renewed attention over the past 20 years or so. Now, I say renewed attention because Martin Luther paid a lot of attention to this 500 years ago. But more and more theologians and practitioners are writing and speaking again on this topic of theology of work. Many books are now being written on this subject. Now we need more books, and we need more theologians to speak out, because it's going to take some time for this subject to become standard fare in our Christian schools and our churches. Now, it once was standard fare, and I believe it really needs to be renewed as standard fare, not only in our churches, but certainly in our schools. And I'm hoping that everyone going through this course will help change this state of affairs. Well, about 65 years ago, Dorothy Sayers wrote a really powerful essay called Why Work? And in this essay, she said, "The church's approach to an intelligent carpenter is usually confined to exhorting him not to be drunk and disorderly in his leisure hours and to come to church on Sundays. What the church should be telling him is this, that the very first demand that his religion makes upon him is that he should make good tables." She continued, "Church, by all means, and decent forms of amusement certainly, but what use is all that if in the very center of his life and occupation he is insulting God with bad carpentry?" And she also said, "The greater part of the world's intelligent workers have become irreligious, or at least uninterested in religion. But is it astonishing? How can anyone remain interested in a religion which seems to have no concern with 9/10 of his life?" Now, my purpose in sharing all this about the church is not to be critical, but simply to underscore the reality of the situation that cries out for some serious reform. But I do have hope for the future, and that's why I'm teaching this course. Imagine a generation of students who, like George Washington Carver and Jack Van Hardesveld and the hairdresser in Paul Stevens' class, have dispensed with the sacred secular divide, and they're no longer encumbered by Gnostic dualism, and looking at the matter of holistic vocational education and seeing how everyday work fulfills the purposes of God for human beings, Christian schools can really bring extraordinary meaning to the whole question of work. Whether it's a public school that operates according to the ground rules of secularism as they do today, or even a Christian school that operates according to Gnostic dualism, one critical element is missing in both, and that's a holistic vision for vocation. While we can't do much about the situation in the public schools right now, we can do a great deal about the situation in Christian schools. I'd like to focus a bit more on how we can restore a holistic vision for vocation in the Christian schools, and how we can make that an integral part of the standard K-12 curriculum. And if this can be done, and be done effectively in Christian schools, we will really have something truly extraordinary to offer today's world. It's something that the public schools currently are not trying to offer, a biblically holistic vision for work. And if this course can be a catalyst to accomplish that, my prayers will be answered. First, bear in mind that a holistic approach to vocation, just as with a holistic approach to education in general, doesn't begin and end with academics. If you ask many principals today what success means for their school, especially in the public schools, they'll talk about the ability of all students to read at grade level, or they may talk about certain levels of attainment being reached on standardized test scores, tests that measure verbal and spatial abilities, and these are tests that universities look at when considering acceptance. Well, these tests are important. I won't deny that. But as I mentioned in the very first session of this course, the foundation of holistic education is not academics, it's virtue. Yet virtue is not included in the standardized tests. Virtue, however, really was critically important to people like Noah Webster, who said that morals are the basis of government. And he said any educational system that limits instruction to the arts and sciences and rejects the aids of religion in forming the character of its citizens is essentially defective. But even for Webster and the founders of Harvard and Yale, the goal of education was not virtue, in and of itself anyway. Virtue was not the ultimate aim. It was a means to a bigger end. And that purpose was accomplished through human vocation. It was a holistic view of education that enabled the leaders of the integrationist movement in the 1600s to look beyond academics and even beyond virtue itself to the application of academics and virtue to the performance art, you might say, of human vocation. As William Ames put it, from fish farming to cryptography. Now, the Puritans' curriculum of the Technologia, which we mentioned way back in the second lecture, that curriculum that came out of the integrationists' work in the 17th century really provided a driver for early Harvard and Yale. It was a driver that viewed the arts and sciences as means to a greater end, means to the fulfillment of an end that involved the glorification of God in all the earth. Now this was a really grand vision that began with the idea of the whole, and it connected human vocation to that whole. It was a vision that embraced the idea that the God of the Bible really does exist, that he created all things, things that can and should be understood and governed by human beings, and that this discovery and understanding should lead to an imitation of God himself, picking up where he left off in the creative process, carrying it further as George Washington Carver did. And in this imitation of God, glory would be returned back to him. Here is a circle of things. We see God initiating, human beings discovering, human beings imitating the Creator in the use of those things, and through that process, returning glory back to the first cause or to the first being. So this circle began and ended with God, and it provided the driver for education itself. This circle of knowledge, which William Ames called encyclopedia, is spelled out in Dr. David Scott's paper, A Vision of Veritas. William Ames believed that the first link of the circular chain was logic, and the last link was theology. And then between logic and theology were four other academics. They were identified by Ames as grammar, and he defined that as the art of speaking and writing well. And then there was rhetoric. He defined that as the art of speaking and writing ornately. And then there was math, and that was said to be the art of qualifying well. And then there was physics, the art of analyzing nature well. So the circle of knowledge, or the encyclopedia, was supported and surrounded by 6 disciplines, all leading to theology, which was the last link in the circular chain. And he defined that as the art of living well. This, in a nutshell, was the Puritan vision for education and for vocation. The purpose of education was to prepare people for living well, and vocation was a major part of living well. After all, it's what humans do for the majority of their waking hours. This is the vision that allowed the Puritans to speak of a man's shop as well as his chapel as holy ground. Now, as Dr. Scott notes in his paper, The Vision of Veritas, the Puritan idea of education provided, as he put it, a philosophical foundation for the working vocations, because humankind was created in the image of the divine artist. The vocations allow the human being to participate in the ongoing divine master plan of creation. Vocation functions spiritually as a kind of performance art, a participation in God's ongoing mission for creation. Through this circular pattern of the created order, humanity can fulfill its cultural mandate, Genesis 1:26-28, and return glory back to God. Now, fulfilling the first commission of Genesis 1 through, as Dr. Scott put it, the performance art of vocation, that is what provided a driver for education in the early years of Harvard and Yale. Now, it was a driver that linked education with the overarching call of fulfilling the first commission of Genesis 1, ruling over the material world as God's co-workers, imitating him by developing the raw materials that he provided for us, creating and shaping them into new things. And like Carver did, this was the practical way that human beings glorified God, and this was what brought extraordinary meaning not only to education but to all of life in the here and now. Now, this driver of education, which really was birthed out of the Reformation in Northern Europe, and it was carried into the field of education by the integrationists like John Comenius, all that had a profound effect on the development of the Western world. Well, it's nice to think that maybe someday the monopoly that secularism currently holds over the public schools will be replaced by a truly market-free system. But until that day comes, I think we're going to have to focus in on how we can work toward restoring a holistic view of vocation to the Christian schools. Now, the problem, as I've said before, is not just atheism or humanism. Yes, those isms have led to the disappearance of the book and the vision of the whole and society at large. And this is a huge problem that really cries out for rectification. But the Gnostic dualism that tends to infect the Christian community has also contributed to the disappearance of the vision of the whole in our own schools. A return to a holistic vision for vocation is not going to happen by providing a lesson or two on the topic in a Bible class. It really is going to require a systemic approach to theology of vocation integrated throughout the K-12 curriculum. And this is what I want to propose to you in this session: developing a systemic approach to restoring a holistic vision for vocation into the standardized curriculum of Christian schools. Now, when I use the term vocation, I want to say that I'm not just referring to what people do when they get through school to earn a paycheck. Vocation is also something people do in school. For students, their vocation for now is a calling to study. And study is work. It's often hard work. Well, let's come at this challenge of developing a systemic curriculum for theology of work by recalling the definition of work itself that I gave you many lectures ago. The definition went like this: work worth doing is any expenditure of energy, mental or physical, for pay or not, that rightly manages God's stuff and employs my God-given abilities to benefit others or prepares me to do so. Now, this definition broadens the concept of work to include the work of students, and it enables all of us to see that work worth doing also includes mowing the lawn on the weekend and washing the dishes after supper. Well, let's help the next generation to embrace the idea that work is not a curse. It isn't something God put in place after the fall as a punishment. Yes, as a result of sin in the world, our work is much harder. It can be toilsome now due to the effects of sin in the world, but work itself is something God gave Adam and Eve to do before the fall, to tend and keep the garden, to name the animals. These were mental and physical expenditures of energy prior to the fall that God asked Adam and Eve to do. Now, God works too, and if he works, it can't be a curse. The integrationists of the 17th century embraced a vision for vocation that really brought extraordinary meaning to ordinary work, whether it was making shoes or growing crops. Partly because they understood that the material world is not a place to escape, but it's a place to cultivate. And the ideas about work that grew out of the Reformation through such people as Martin Luther and John Calvin, those ideas resulted in what some historians have called the Protestant work ethic. Now, although it wasn't just the Protestants that had a biblical work ethic, the monasteries of the Middle Ages were really centers of great productivity and advancement even before the Reformation. But theology of work is no longer an integral part of the Christian school curriculum, whether it's Protestant or otherwise. I call it the missing curriculum. I wrote an article titled that in a homeschool magazine. If you'd like a copy of that, send me an email and I'll send you a copy. Now, if theology of work were to really be a part of the standard curriculum of a Christian school, you would find a scope and sequence for that subject in your school's curriculum guide. If it is in your curriculum guide, let me know about it. Please send me a copy. I'd love to see it. Well, I was the principal of a Christian school for 14 years. It never entered my mind that we ought to have a scope and sequence for theology of work in our K-12 curriculum guide. We did have a curriculum guide, and there was a scope and sequence for all kinds of things, but theology of work just wasn't there. In fact, I don't know of any published curriculum on the market today that really presents theology of work in a systematic way throughout the K-12 years. Now, some of you may be thinking, what exactly do you mean theology of work? And what specific concepts would you expect to be included in a scope and sequence in a curriculum guide? Well, those are good questions. I don't have a written example of a school curriculum guide to show you, and hopefully I will at some point as you work on this, but I can give you some help in developing a scope and sequence for your school, or at least for the grade and subject matter that you teach if you're not an administrator. Well, first, remember the good advice to begin with the end in mind. And with that in mind, I suggest that you consider what exactly it is that should go through the mind of an adult who has a well-developed theology of work. What are the signs of an adult who truly understands theology of work? Or you might say it this way, what exactly do we want adult workers of the future to know and practice with respect to theology of vocation? Well, once the end is clearly identified, then it's a matter of thinking through how those outcomes can be age-appropriately taught to the next generation. In other words, which concepts of theology of vocation should be taught at which grade levels? I'm of the opinion that to restore theology of work to the DNA of a Christian school, it will really require integrating that within the academic subjects that are already part of the school curriculum. That is, to integrate theology of work into such classes as history or social studies, science, math, and language arts, and to do this in such a way that it adds to the student's understanding of whatever academic subject they're talking about. Now let me be specific here and give you some examples. Why not include the life and work of George Washington Carver as part of a biology class in the 9th or 10th grade, or part of a unit of study on plants in the 4th grade? In such a way, Carver's holistic view of vocation can be discussed right in the context of a class dealing with plants. Why not do a study on the biblical view of craftsmanship in an art, media, or shop class, and include some of the concepts I shared with you in the lecture called Have You Ever Seen a Secular Color? In a world history class, when ancient Greece is discussed, that would be a very fitting time to introduce Platonism and the lingering problem of Gnostic dualism and how it affects the view that many Christians have with respect to work in the material world. And why not include Gary Starkweather and his holistic view of technology as part of a computer skills class? It fits. It makes sense. It connects technology with the bigger picture of the doctrine of vocation. And it does it in a very fitting way within the context of the academic subject itself. It's not an add-on. It's an integral part of the academic discussion. It rounds it out. It makes it whole. Certainly a unit on theology of work would be essential for a number of topics that come up in social studies. For example, the role of business in alleviating poverty in developing countries. That would be a great opportunity for integrating a holistic view of work.
The best of business's mission is a right understanding of business and a holistic understanding of mission put together. I think if you recognize that God cares about business as the means of distributing goods and services throughout his world, then I think you realize that that view of business taken to a third world country to bring hope to people that are economically deprived in the name of Jesus Christ can be a very wonderful thing. I spent some time last summer in the Central African Republic where 2/3 of the people live on less than $1 a day, and there are no jobs to be had. If we could create jobs for them, these people could be fulfilled in these jobs and use their God-given gifts, yes, to get money because they need it, but even more than that would be to do the work to the glory of God. So being able to create the opportunity for these people to do work is a really important thing.
So you see that as one way to address the issue of poverty?
Absolutely. And I do believe that as Christians in bringing about reconciliation in our world, our role in helping bring reconciliation in this area of brokenness is a really important task. I would define the word gospel in a very holistic way. It's really interesting that you look at Matthew 28, which is the standard scripture that we use to talk about the Great Commission. And in that it includes personal salvation, it includes the transformation of nations, it includes making disciples of people. So I think discipleship, transformation, and personal salvation are all encompassed in the gospel as I see it in the scripture. Sin has really permeated work as it has every other aspect of life. I believe as Christians we're called on to give hope. And so we can not only tell other people about the saving power of Jesus Christ, but we can show them that there is another way to do work, that we can in fact get joy from our work, that we can do our work in a right way, that we can have right objectives, that we can treat people well, etc., etc. So it's a platform for all of those things.
That really broadens the word evangelism.
Yes, it does. But we have to be very careful because sometimes when we broaden it, we forget about being born again.
Yeah.
And of course, we have to think of every aspect of this. If you take care of the physical needs and don't share with people the good news of Jesus Christ, what have you done? These are tightly entwined, and too often as Christians we have pulled them apart and said, well, this is more important than this. And I don't think Jesus says this is more important than this. He said all this is important.
I believe that anyone's theology of work is understanding how what they do advances the kingdom of God here on earth. And business, I believe, does that in two ways. First of all, it contributes to the economic well-being of communities around the world, which allows everyone to use their God-given gifts and talents. And secondly, as the sole source of wealth creation in the world, it enables every other social, civic, and even spiritual institution to exist. So think about it for a minute. Business is the only source of wealth creation in the world, big and small businesses of all types. Every other institution, from governments, they don't create wealth. All their wealth comes from taxpayers. Hospitals, schools, churches, every NGO, every 501c3 organization is actually a consumer of that wealth. So businesses' role is to generate wealth through not only the creation and sale of products and services that people need and want, but also through the creation of jobs so that that wealth is sustainable through the taxes and salaries and also the generous giving of businesses and of business people as well. So without successful, ethical, sustainable business playing its role in the world doesn't work. I feel God's pleasure in both the product and the process of my work because of the way it enables so many people around the world to use their God-given gifts for good and for God.
So I'm suggesting that we enfold a systematic approach to theology of work into already existing subjects. Yes, in the Bible class, but also the other academic classes as well. And I believe this is the most fitting way to go about the restoration of a vision for vocation. Whatever grade level you teach, whatever academic subject you deal with, consider ways in which you can intentionally incorporate theology of work into the academic subjects you're already teaching. Weave it into what you're already doing. Now, to really get theology of work back into the DNA of Christian schools, it's going to require more than individual teachers thinking of opportunities to link subject matter with theology of work. And that's better than nothing, but I really think a systemic approach that gets a scope and sequence into your curriculum guide in writing is the best way to go. Now, I said earlier that a good way to figure out a scope and sequence for theology of vocation in the whole K-12 curriculum would be to first figure out what's the end product and then figure out how you can get to that end. Let me be a little more specific on that. For a suggested list of outcomes, I'd like you to take a look at 50 signs of a well-developed theology of work. If there's any document that I think spells out the end outcome in a very clear and concise way, this is it. This document is located in the course content area of your distance learning online platform in the Session 10 section. Go ahead and put this presentation on pause and retrieve that document and print out a copy. Now, many of the concepts on this list of 50 are probably already part of your Bible curriculum in most Christian schools, but the challenge is to specifically connect these concepts with a vision for vocation, and to do that throughout the entire academic program. So with that in mind, I would like to suggest that we take a look at a couple of statements on this document just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. In about the middle of the first page, there's a statement that says, I realize God is present everywhere in my workplace, all the time. Okay, this is a vital truth for every worker to bear in mind, no matter what their age is. God sees all we do, and he's always there to assist when we need his help. Now the workplace of a kindergartner is the classroom, and the vocation of the kindergartner is learning. Now, I think some of you might be resistant to the idea of calling the classroom a workplace, and that's because the word work does not have a positive connotation in our secularized culture. This is another indicator that we need to redeem the word work. It's a positive word. It's a happy word, or at least it should be. We can help it to become such. Well, we can help kindergartners to own the idea that work is a good thing and that we were actually created to work. It's a godly thing to work. And in the process, we can make it a point in our kindergarten curriculum to emphasize the idea that God is present everywhere in my workplace all the time. Now, this idea isn't something that can be done in a single lesson, of course. It's something that would need to be reinforced many times at the kindergarten level in a variety of ways and in a context of many different academic subjects. Maybe it could be a recurring theme throughout the year. Well, the point here is that if a school seriously decides to make theology of work an emphasis at the kindergarten level, specific work-related concepts need to be stated in the official curriculum guide for all kindergarten teachers, both present and future, as a guide for them. This is a serious effort to focus on theology of work in the context of academic learning objectives throughout the year. Well, the next question to ask oneself is, at what grade level should that specific learning idea that God is present everywhere in my workplace all the time, where should that be reinforced? At what grade level and in what subjects? Well, these are questions only a given school can answer, but they are questions that can and should be intentionally addressed in the school's curriculum guide. We're talking about specific learning objectives here, introduced and reinforced at specific grade levels in connection with specific academic subject matter. That's the kind of intentionality this sort of a project requires. This is what will get theology of work and a vision for vocation back into the DNA of Christian schools. We need to get it in print, into writing, and if necessary, chisel it into stone, so to speak, where it's hard to remove. Well, putting together a well-thought-out scope and sequence for theology of work in a K-12 curriculum is a project that really could take a number of years on the part of a school staff. Let's take a look at another statement on the list of 50 signs of a well-developed theology of work. A little lower on page 1 of the list of 50 signs, there's a statement that says, "I realize that to accomplish His purpose in the earth, God works through the work that I do, and He is able to be glorified in the process." So the questions are, at what grade level should this particular work concept be introduced, and at what specific grades should it be reinforced? And how can this idea be integrated into a variety of academic topics? This is the sort of decision-making process that I believe is really, really important for a well-constructed curriculum guide. Now, if putting together a scope and sequence for theology of work in the K-12 curriculum of your school, it really isn't within your power because you're not an administrator, the next best alternative is to consider how theology of work can be incorporated into your own teaching responsibilities at whatever grade level you're working with and whatever academic subjects you're dealing with. And if you're a pastor of a church, consider how you can incorporate concepts of theology of work into a series of sermons or sprinkled throughout the entire year in various places throughout the Scripture. Now, one of the requirements for this course is to teach a lesson to either your students or your peers or perhaps to the parents of your students, a lesson that incorporates at least one element of theology of work with whatever academic subject you're dealing with on a regular basis. For this, you will use the resources that are required for this course, namely the God's Pleasure at Work book and the Difference One Life Can Make. These are two books with DVDs from which you can draw ideas for teaching others. Now, after you teach your lesson, send me the outline of your lesson plan along with a 1 or 2 page summary of how it went and email it to me at overman@biblicalworldview.com. Now, no matter what grade level you work with, there's something in these resources that can be integrated into an academic lesson, and it can be adjusted to the age-appropriate level of your students. Remember the lesson you saw in session 6 of the preschool teacher who incorporated the first commission of Genesis 1 into her lesson on the growth needs of plants? Well, that's an example of the kind of integrative approach that I'm talking about here, an approach that combines some element of theology of work with normal academic objectives. Now, to help you to think through this, I've provided a document that you can print out that lists certain topics in the reference books that connect with certain academic subjects. This document is located in the course content area of your online distance learning platform in the session 10 area. Now, the lesson plan that you send to me doesn't need to be real detailed. Basically, just a bullet outline of your presentation and a description of the group that you taught, its age and the context of it would be good. Well, one of the things that I did when I was the principal of a Christian high school was to develop a program that afforded high school students the opportunity to gain work experience out in the community. And this program really became an integral part of the curriculum for all students in the 11th and 12th grade in our school. And I have to say it was one of the more successful programs that we did. And during those years, Peggy Kellogg was one of the high school teachers who oversaw the program, which we called Apprenticeship Training Program, or ATP for short. And I'd like to introduce you to Peggy and also to one of the students who participated in this program while Peggy was supervising it. So let's listen to this interview, and that will conclude this session. Well, here I am with Peggy Kellogg, who for several years was the supervisor of the apprenticeship training program at the school where I was the principal. She was a teacher there for 15 years, and she also has 15 years teaching elsewhere, so she has 30 years of experience as a teacher. We're really privileged to have her with us today. And along with Peggy, I'm excited to have a former student who participated in the apprenticeship training program, Susanna Scholl, maiden name Susanna Wells.
Yes.
She's now a grown woman, married with 2 children. And we're doing this interview in a print shop because we wanted to provide kind of a workplace ambiance for this. Peggy, let me start with you. What was your role in making the apprenticeship training program work?
My role was to be a supervisor of students, taking the student from the classroom to the work world. And through that goal, we had several stages that the students went through. First of all, we gathered a group of mentors, people in a whole variety of different fields.
Where did you find good mentors?
Well, we asked parents, do you have a job you'd like to come and explain to the students? What is your job description, basically? And then we would have the parents even recommend people that they worked with that they thought were somebody that they would like their students to know more about that particular field, that neighbor or relative church member was interested in. So we developed a pool of mentors.
You really seem to thrive in your role as a supervisor for the apprenticeship training program. Why was it such a pleasure for you, Peggy?
Well, I think that it was a good fit for me. Just like I want to share with my students that they find a job that fits their gifts.
Right.
I felt like this program really clicked with me and clicked with my kind of gifts, which was loving the students and wanting to train them to draw from them the best qualities that they had.
Did you take any training for this position?
Yes, I attended Seattle Pacific University to finish a master's degree there, and I chose curriculum and instruction because my 2 sons were learning so differently from each other that it really piqued my interest and my motivation to find out what were the different learning styles that they had, and then I wanted to apply that to my own classroom teaching. So I got training in learning styles, personality differences, and even would give my husband some of the tests, and he would say, "Oh, you can't give me a test like that. Nobody can test somebody's aptitude and job preference by taking a test." So I said, "Well, let me try this one," and it was a Myers-Briggs type indicator, and he was like, "Wow, that really fits."
It worked.
And it was fun.
So you had the kids actually go through these tests to try to find the right placement for them. It's kind of a matching. Susanna, where did you work? What sorts of things did you do? Tell us about your experience.
I actually had 2 different placements over the course of the program. One of them was in a travel agency, and the other one was with a jeweler. So I would say that the travel agency was a good fit around just kind of office administrative skills. Fits well with my analytics.
Yeah.
I was able to get kind of exposure to a computer in the work world for the first time for booking travel, and really just worked. I had a primary mentor, but was at the direction of the 5 different people in the travel agency, would do and assemble things for different tour packages, anything that they asked.
So you're actually helping to set up tours?
Oh, I was, or not setting up the tours per se with the people that they were working with, but really pulling together the materials that would be used on a tour.
Sure.
So
gotcha.
had
Pretty
that
responsible job.
I think it was, yeah, for a 16, 17-year-old.
Yeah. Tell us about your next apprenticeship.
So I had the opportunity to apprentice with a jeweler, which I am not an artist type person, but I definitely have an appreciation for gemstones and, you know, nice, pretty things like
diamonds
any
and
woman,
things like
diamonds,
that. Right.
rubies. And so really had an opportunity to work with the jeweler one-on-one to learn so much. And being an inquisitive person, I probably drove him crazy asking so many questions, but had a really great opportunity.
What an opportunity. Did you actually make rings?
I did actually make rings and made different jewelry and learned the process end to end. It was...
Did you enjoy it?
I enjoyed it.
That's great.
It may not have been my strength, played to my strengths, but it was definitely something that stretched me, and I enjoyed it.
Was the apprenticeship training program a requirement for graduation, Peggy?
It was.
Were the students graded?
The students were graded.
And did the mentors have any part in the evaluation of the students too?
Their mentor had a timesheet that they would initial for the student. The student would put, you know, when they arrived, when they left, that kind of thing, and then what their job responsibilities were.
Did they have to keep a log or write papers?
They kept a journal each time, and then that journal went together in a final paper that they put together for part of their grade.
Okay.
So we graded them on that paper. Their recommendation, I guess you would say, from their employer, quote unquote. Right. They weren't getting paid for the job, but their employer would say, yes, this person has, you know, made an impact in our company. They're making a difference. They're here on time. They show up. There's good open communication, and they work well with others, which was really important.
As I recall, you spent a lot of time with the mentors out in the field. How often did you go out and visit a student on the job site?
I would try to visit them 2 times during the quarter and more if I could, but I would try to get around to at least 2 times a quarter for about 20 students who were placed.
Susanna, how was the ATP experience scheduled into the school day?
It was Tuesdays and Thursdays, so from 11:30 in the morning till 3 o'clock in the afternoon. During the school day, we would go out and work with our mentors.
Were the other teachers supportive of the program? Did they see it as an important part of the students' education?
I don't think the program would have worked except that you prepared the staff so well, because your vision for the whole idea of work and worship and the total view of education is part of life. And what we do in life is worship. The way we act in life, the way we work is worship. And I think the teachers saw that when the students went out and had this apprenticeship training experience, it made their education so much more valuable.
Do you think there was a positive sort of spillover effect on the other coursework the students were doing? Was there a sense of a little more maturity that was brought into the school?
I would say there was a real level of maturity and a definite connection. It made the spilling over to what they were doing in the classroom much more relevant. It wasn't just an assignment. It was like, wow, this matters now.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Susanna, tell us the inside story. What did the students really think of the program? That's a dangerous question, but I'll ask it.
I don't recall anyone ever complaining.
That's good.
Which says something. And I think that honestly we were out from under the watchful eye of teachers and parents. Mm-hmm. It was as though we're kind of transitioning into adulthood, yep. being entrusted with a responsibility.
Trusted, yes.
Being accountable to people outside of our core network and not family or familiar yep. people, but some, mentors in the workplace. Yep. And I really believe that the students rose to the occasion and performed as to what was expected from them.
They did. We were very proud of our students, and that was a real blessing for all of us to see. When the guest employers came to speak to the students when they were 11th graders, and they talked to the kids about what they did and their job entailed, and what sort of mentors came in to speak, and what sort of jobs did the students have?
We had nurses, doctors, lawyers, construction, carpentry, fishermen who would fish in Alaska could come and share. Let's see.
Computer technology
We had electricians.
People?
Yes, we had we had a technology person. We had a gentleman who ran quite a large company, and he, in fact, took some of our students with him to show him his work site.
A field trip.
And a field trip there, yes.
So the students had a pretty good idea of what the possibilities were for their
They had a large
mentorship.
pool, I think, of choices, really.
Yeah.
They did.
Yeah. What did your fellow students do?
One of my friends was in an architectural firm, others in construction, so different office environments, entrepreneurial, car mechanic.
As I recall, we had someone in a law office who was interested in law. All kinds of jobs.
Quite a variety.
It was surprising to me when I would go to the field to visit the students to see the kinds of trust that they were given for the different levels of work. It was really exciting.
Yeah. You mentioned the word trust again. That was huge for this. Were the parents involved in the process at all?
I think the parents were vital to the whole program. I think the thing that I think made the program so successful is because we had the administration, we had teachers, we had the parents, all on the same page.
Yeah.
I think they were excited about the program and really supportive of it. So yes, they were involved.
Susanna, looking back, are there any particular things about your experience with the apprenticeship training program that carried through to your later life?
I think that the character development aspect of it, there's a definite honor to authority. And when you're given direction, when your boss says jump, you say how high. And that's the expectation.
Sure.
And to take initiative and to really look around you and see and learn whatever you can, and to build your skill set really and make the most out of the job that you're in at the time.
Yes.
And I really think that we considered ourselves, and maybe this is more in hindsight, but we truly were ambassadors for the school.
You were.
For the program, for Christ, out in the work field.
Yes.
And it wasn't necessarily that we were working in Christian environments either.
No, no, not at
That's
all.
right.
Yeah. Did Peggy train you at all in writing a resume, and did you have to go through a job interview process?
We wrote resumes on more than one occasion, and they continued to grow as we got exposure to more things, so that was a plus.
Yeah.
We did mock interviews as students with one another, and we then went out to the different mentors and actually had a sit-down interview and exchange to determine right fit. And I think one of the things that I've learned over my course of working and starting in that program is, with the individual skills and the needs of the company looking to find a win-win.
Yep.
So in the interview process, even now as a boss, when I am interviewing somebody, it's really a courtship, if you will, of finding a
Sure.
win-win and not just landing a job for the sake of a job,
Yeah.
but a win for the individual and a win for the company.
Absolutely. Well, to learn that skill at such an early age is incredibly valuable. Now, the ATP experience wasn't a career placement program, but did any of the students actually end up following a career path that they started in the ATP program?
The one student that really stands out to me is a young man who, as a student, was not really confident and maybe a little bit directionless, but he was more of an introvert, and when he got into the field with a mentor who was into computers, he blossomed. Absolutely blossomed.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about.
Yes, and it was so rewarding to see this kind of bright light come into his future, and he's at that job today. He's still with that company.
Peggy, what was the school really trying to accomplish through the apprenticeship training program? How did the ATP experience really fit with our Christian philosophy of education, or what really justified all the time and expense and effort that went into it? Were there any particular biblical values we were really seeking to reinforce or practice?
The school philosophy was that work is worship. And so what does the student get to do? But actually, yes, they do their homework, and that's worship. And they do their studies, but to look at all of their life as a gift from the Lord and a way to honor Him. So it was really exciting to let them take it then to the next level and get out as a student where they have the protection, I would say, of a covering from the school and the mentorship program. They have the protection there to be covered, but also to get out and try their hands at different things and find out what they really are gifted at, what their gifts really are. So it was a chance for them to seek the Lord and to develop character, to see a skill set in operation and develop other skill sets that they couldn't develop in the classroom. I think they returned to their classrooms with a greater vision for that, taking that test, for writing that resume, for learning how to write a good essay. They were going to have to do, maybe their boss could ask them to write a letter to this other company, and just having the background of knowing, I know how to do that, building confidence into them that this education, my teachers are doing a good job. I'm learning how to function.
You mentioned character development. That was pretty big. And there were occasions where there were rough spots that came, and it was real life, wasn't it?
It was real life,
there were
that's
issues
right.
that had to be dealt with, and through your guidance, they were dealt with well. It was a great experience. Well, in conclusion, Peggy, let me ask, is there anything that you would do differently if you had a chance to do it over again? What sort of advice would you give to any administrator out there who might be watching this and thinking, hey, maybe I should do that at our school? What are some of the key elements for starting and maintaining a really successful apprenticeship training program?
Well, I think the administrator should have a vision for what he really wants from his school.
Yep.
And what the end result is that he wants or she wants for the student.
Yep.
They need to make sure that the parents and the teachers are on the same page with him in this vision, because it can't just be one person trying to push the program through. The teachers have to see the vision, buy into it, and the parents have to agree that this is something that I think would be good for my son or daughter to participate in. I'm excited about it. I want to support it, because the parents in many cases had to provide transportation. If the student didn't drive, didn't have access to a car, then the parent would have to be the one to help the student at least work work that out.
But they loved the program too, didn't they?
They did.
Were
They
very,
did.
very supportive of it.
And many of them ended up being mentors. Like I had
Interesting.
one gentleman who was an electrician,
Yeah.
and he said, find me a young person who would like to work with me as an
Yeah.
electrician. I can make a difference for them because this is such
Yeah.
a great job. He loved his job and wanted someone that he could pass his trade skills on to.
Yes.
And so that's just one example of
Yeah. It was a real community effort.
it was.
But many of
really
the
that.
mentors had no connection with the school at all. They were people that came our way, or we heard about, or someone had an interest in working for that person.
I think that was a real plus for the program too, was for students to be able to see that other people are excited about what they're doing
Yeah.
and willing to invest in them. And then that gave them a chance too to prove their character
Yeah.
with other people.
And to live out the implications of their faith as
That's
well.
exactly right.
From a student's perspective, do you have anything to add? What would you put into the program?
I think what I would add to the program is at the beginning level set around business as a whole, and maybe kind of stepping back and taking a 30,000-foot view of how the business world works.
Yes.
So types of companies, whether it's a sole proprietorship, a limited liability, a corporation, the difference between a publicly held company and a privately held company, and really transfer that knowledge into the student to understand that if I am working with a sole proprietor as my mentor, I am really contributing to the bottom line for that company. And if it's a corporation that is publicly traded, then it's really an investment that is a payback to the shareholder.
Sure.
To really kind of give that business perspective.
Yes, very good, Susanna. Thank you. And thank you, Peggy, too, for taking the time to reminisce a bit and to share with others the rich experience through that program. And I believe that what you've shared today will inspire ideas in educators, I hope, all around the world. So thank you again for taking time to talk.
Thank you. Thanks for mentoring me.